For our first video in this Intro to Programming series, we will be covering variables, syntax rules, convention rules, variable assignment, and data types. So for this first video, we won't be running any actual code. I have this Replit window open, and as discussed in the previous video, on the left-hand side is where all of our Python code will be displayed, and then on the right side is where the results of that Python code will be displayed. But for our first video, what I want to talk about is the fundamental concept of data and how to hold data, specifically starting with variables. So variables in programming are a way to hold and store data in memory. When we are talking about memory in the computer, whether it's on the cloud, there's some place where all of the memory is held. That's where all of the data that we are utilizing in either programming or just the programs themselves in the computer is held. So variables in programming allows us to hold information. Well, what kind of information do they hold? Taking a look at line 14, this is our first line of Python code. We have a variable name on the left-hand side and the value that we are holding. So right now, I am holding the text Edward M. And notice that I put this line of code under this note here, strings. This is just a way for me to show under what category these data are under. We'll expand a little bit more on what a string is in a little bit once we have gone over what integers and floats are. But first, to fully understand the variable, we have to understand the purpose of a variable. The purpose of a variable is to, as mentioned previously, hold and store data in memory. So variables are just a way to remember information. What kind of information can we hold? Well, that depends on what kind of information that you have on hand. And as information is varied and comes in a lot of different shapes and sizes, there are different data types. So strings was the first data type that we discussed. Integers will be the second data type that we'll be looking at. And as far as data types goes, integers should be pretty familiar. Integers are simply just whole numbers. And as you can see again, the repetition of having the variable on the left side with the equal sign in the middle with the value on the right side, this is the process of creating a variable in Python and storing a value in that variable. So for the integers data type, I have the variable age storing the value of 35. And again, the value of integers or the type of integers is just that they are numeric values with whole numbers. And then floats are another numeric data type, but this time instead of whole values or whole number values, they are decimal values. And just a couple more examples of floats. You can see I have the item price of maybe a product at 38.23, the value of pi at 3.14, and the sales tax percentage represented as a decimal value. So you can see in programming there are different types of data that allows us to represent information, integers for whole numbers, floats for decimal numbers. Now that we have a clear distinction between numeric values and text values, I want to go back to discussing the strings a little bit more. Strings are a unique data type in that at first, when you see a string or when you think of a string, all you might be thinking of is alphabetical characters. But actually, strings are a combination of alphabetical characters, special characters, but also numerical characters as well. You might be asking yourself, well, we have these numeric data types, integers and floats. Why would I ever need to have numeric values represented as a string as a text? Well, There are certain information that exist in the real world that are represented as numeric values, but are not treated like standard numeric values. For instance, informations like zip code and phone numbers are all represented as numeric values, and yet we do not treat them like standard numeric values. In that standard numeric values, we usually think of values that we can perform math operations, right? Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and so on and so forth. While we have the ability to perform those math operations to integers and floats, we would never perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, division on either your phone number or your zip code. So, part of being a programmer and understanding the data is being able to represent the data in the proper way. Sometimes numeric values will be represented as strings. Other times, numeric values will be represented as integers and floats because they are data where we would want to perform some sort of mathematical operations on them. Now that we've discussed how we have different data types that exist in programming and how we can assign them to a variable, let's talk about variables a little bit. Now, we've copy pasted a lot of code here on lines 14 to 16, 19 to 20, and 23 to 25. But if you take a look at all of the variable names have a clear purpose. The variable names are descriptive or representative of the value they are holding. Variable names in programming can be anything. And when I say anything, I really do mean anything. So in this situation, I can actually create a variable called apple and store my name in it, or create a variable called banana and store my zip code in it. And as far as Python is concerned, the programming language, they are okay with this. But as developers, if we were to ever look at this code, we can clearly see there's something going wrong with how the variables are created and how they are not representative of the data that we are holding. So when we are creating variables, we need to be aware of two things: syntax rules versus convention rules. So, syntax rules are the first thing to always consider because syntax rules are Python's rules on how code needs to be written. And every programming language has their own syntax rules, but we will be discussing Python's rules specifically. So, with Python syntax rules, variable names cannot have any empty spaces. So you can see here full name, zip code, phone number, item price, sales tax. These are all variable names that contain two separate words. And if I were to have these two variables with two separate spaces, you can see immediately that some error messages popping up. So Python does not allow for separate variables with empty spaces. You have to have a continuous string of characters, and underscores can be used to represent empty spaces if you have a variable with multiple words. Along with that is variables cannot start with numeric values. So you can see if I put a numeric value in front of these variables, they immediately highlight up as errors and it will not work. However, once you do start a variable with an alphabetical character or even an underscore, which again represents an which also represents a character, then you can have any combination of characters or numbers that follow. So I can add numeric values to the ends or even the middle of our variables, and Python doesn't care because our variables start with a character instead. Now that we have talked about syntax rules, let's talk about convention rules. Convention rules are rules that the programming community has come together and decided these are some of the guidelines that all developers should follow so that we are writing clear, understandable code, but also we're trying to create a format or a standard of how code should be written. Convention rules, like programming languages, do come and go out of style. So I will be talking about the convention rules as it is at the moment of this recording in early 2026. Conventions for variable names are pretty standard. First, we are in the era of underscores. So, as mentioned previously, if you have any variables that have multiple words, we now use underscores to represent the empty spaces in between them. There are other conventions that have existed before. One of them that was popular previously was known as camel casing, where instead of having empty spaces in between the separate words of a variable, we used to mash all the words together, but to show where the new words begin, we would capitalize the beginning of each word starting from the second word. But the camel casing convention was popular for a very long time, and because it's been popular for such a long time, chances are you will see them. But at the moment, I think the modern convention or the more popular convention nowadays is to use the underscores for your variables. But also, part of the conventions for variable naming is that variable names should be representative of the data. And that might seem like a obvious one, but at the same time, how descriptive of how we name these variables should also be considered. For instance, this variable full name. Now, I could have simply just created this variable as name, and that doesn't mean that this variable is wrong. This is a name, and it is being stored inside of a variable name. But to be more explicit and to be descriptive as possible, I think the better variable name in this situation would be full name, since it is my first and last name. So the conventions are that variables should be as descriptive of the data that it is holding. And if caught between what being less descriptive and being too descriptive, I think being more descriptive would be the better way to lean towards. So to quickly cover this video, we have talked about variables, which again are symbolic names that act as containers for storing data in memory. Syntax rules are rules that we must follow that Python sets, and if we break syntax rules, then it means that our program will not work. The syntax rules for variables are as follows. Variable names cannot be a Python keyword. We haven't met any Python keywords yet, so we'll put that in the back pocket for now. Variable names cannot contain spaces, which we fixed using underscores. First character must be a letter or an underscore. After first character, you may use letters, digits, or underscores, and then variable names are case sensitive. So just because a variable shares the same set of letters but differ in all caps does not mean that they are treated as the same variables. In fact, if we take a look here, if we create a second variable for pi with lowercase letters, line 30 pi and line 31 pi are treated as two separate variables because in Python, variable names are case sensitive. Convention rules are, again, guidelines that the community have come together to try to help set a standard for writing good, clean code. And in terms of conventions for variables, it's pretty standard. Variable name should reflect its use, and it should be as descriptive as possible. Variable assignment is the process of creating a variable and assigning a value to it. And that's what we've been doing this entire video. If you take a look at every line of Python code that we've written, all we've been doing is variable assignment. I create a variable full name, I assign it the value of Edward M, and the equal sign is essentially what allows us to create this variable assignment. And then lastly, we've covered three data types. Strings, which are a sequence of characters, including special characters and numbers. integers that are whole numbers, and then floats that are decimal numbers. Now, these are not the only data types that exist in Python. In fact, there are many more different data types that exist, but we will tackle them as we move through the series and as we learn more and more about Python. Now, it's your turn to write some code. So, Replit, again, is a free service, and it's pretty limited in its free service, but we can use plenty of what Replit gives us to do everything we need to do within this video series. So what I would suggest is to learn programming, you gotta program, you gotta write code. For our exercise today, what I would suggest is to try to create 3 variables and assign them values for each data type discussed. So we've discussed strings, integers, and floats. Create 3 variables each per data type and assign them values. Go outside of the box to try to think of variables and values that aren't necessarily what I have placed here. There are plenty of examples of variables that you can come up on your own. If you can always use these codes that I have for you as a reference, but I highly suggest trying to get out of the comfort zone. Look at my code maybe for inspiration on what type of information and what variables that you'd like to create. But I think coming up with wholly new variables that have nothing to do with the variables that I've discussed will allow you to kind of expand your mind in terms of understanding programming and getting used to writing code and understanding the scope of programming, which, as we'll quickly find out, encompasses a lot of the things that we do on our day to day life.